Greetings and blessings from Jerusalem to all of our viewers. It's the beginning of Sefer Shmot. Last week we read the first section of Sefer Shmot, which of course is entitled Shmot. And at the very beginning of the parasha, so we see something novel that apparently we would have to resolve a question, because we all are used to mentioning the Gemara in Shabbos that says that why is Mount Sinai called Har Sinai? Because by Har Sinai, where the Jewish people received the Torah, so Sinai is an expression of Sinai. In Aramaic, Sinai also is a definition of Sinai. So Yarda Sinai le'umay sa'olam, to all the nations of the world at that period of time hated the Jewish people, because after all, the Jewish people became the chosen people by accepting the Torah at Sinai, which other nations rejected. The Jewish people accepted it, and that caused a type of pathological hatred and resentment of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people have suffered for thousands of years because of this hatred. However, whether we define this hatred as being sinas chinam, or we define it as true anti-Semitism, yet for one nation, anti-Semitism started earlier. And the Jewish people, almost unaware, and indeed there was a very sudden change of events that took place, found themselves the object of true anti-Semitism, and that of course is in Mitzrayim. The Netziv, the famous Netziv, the founder of the Volozhiny Yeshiva in the 1800s in the city of Volozhin in Lita, points this out. The pasuk says, "Hova nischak maloi." After the Torah tells us that Bnei Yisrael rav otzu mimenu, that the Jewish people are more numerous and stronger than we are. The indigenous Mitzrayim were weaker and numerically were less than the Jewish people in Mitzrayim. To that extent, they multiplied and increased in a relatively short period of time, and the population of the Jewish people exceeded that of indigenous Egyptians. And all of a sudden, the Torah tells us with great drama, "Vayomer el amoy hava nischak maloi peniyilbe," they'll increase even more. "Vayakisachkenem milcham b'neisav gamu al seinenu v'nilcham b'nev olam min haaretz." So Paro brought in his advisors, and he told them, "Get ready, because we have to deal very shrewdly with the Jewish people, lest they increase more and a war befall us, and they'll join our enemies and depart from the land." So this was the counsel that Paro solicited from his advisors and counselors. We'll soon see what the Gemara has to say about this. Yet, in the Haggadah Shel Pesach, when we read the parsha of Mikra Bikurim and Parshas Kisavoy, the pilgrim of old who brought his first fruits to the Beis HaMikdash had to express gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the success that now HaKadosh Baruch Hu bestowed upon him. He was successful in so far as harvesting his crops, so he was duty-bound to tell us a short version of the Exodus, of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And he says, among the other phrases, "Vayoreu oisonu hamitzrim," which is translated that they dealt evilly with us. However, the Netziv points out that grammatically this is an incorrect translation, even though it's been accepted more or less by the mainstream of translators. However, it is incorrect, because if that would be the meaning and the connotation, it should have said Vayareyu Lonu HaMitzvah. Lonu means the object of that evil, that egregious Hanohagil was the Jewish people. So it says Vayareyu Lonu HaMitzvah. And we bring a proof. Now what's the proof that they dealt evilly with us? This pasuk of Avad Ischak Malay, let us deal very shrewdly with the Jewish people, because otherwise, if they increase, they'll join the enemy. So the Netziv said, no. The definition of the word Sonu means they made us into bad people. They demeaned us. They castigated us. And they said that we are not grateful people, we're ingrateful. And not only that, we have absolutely no loyalty to the land that offered us a refuge, offered us an abundance, and we're bad people, demeaning the Jewish people totally. What is the proof? Because Paroi told his advisors, and this was publicized, like the Gemara tells us, that the Jewish people, in case there'll be a war, will not protect the land of Mitzrayim together with the army of Egypt, but on the contrary, they will join the enemy, and this will force us to have to leave Mitzrayim. Did you ever hear of such a bad, disloyal, ingrateful people? That's how it started. Says the Netziv, this was the beginning of anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism is not something which is an emotional hatred. It's pathological hatred for sure, but it doesn't come out in an emotional way. There's a philosophy that first and foremost has to be established. First and foremost, our enemies have to say that we are subhuman people. We have no ethics, we have no morals whatsoever, and we're capable of being mishalim ra tachas toiv, of bad. If we received good, if we were the beneficiaries of good, we'll repay it with bad, and in addition to that, no loyalty whatsoever. This, of course, is a rationalization that will help foster the entire subjugation of the Jewish people. So the aura and the atmosphere that this will establish is simply they deserve it, because they're bad people. But not only that, the Ramban even says more than that, much more. Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim lamiyaldes ha'ivrios. The Jewish people had hospitals and they also had midwives. After his astrologers, who knew astrology, this happens to be a very, very esoteric type of intellectual undertaking, but they were experts in astrology. So the Egyptians' astrologers told Pharaoh that there will be a redeemer to the Jewish people. There's no question about it that they will leave the country. They will be redeemed. There's millions of Jews. They will be redeemed by one individual that as of yet is not born, but he will be born. So obviously, what was the conclusion of the meeting of Havan Yitzchak Maloi? That every single male child that is born, in the future, after Harald asserted that this astrology is true, The Redeemer has not as yet been born. He will be born. So Paro will do the maximum possible to make sure that this Redeemer will be totally destroyed, killed, and murdered by being drowned with all the other Jewish children, because he didn't know who the Redeemer was. So the only possible advice that could be given to Paro is every single Jewish child should be drowned. But beforehand, Paro came up with even a shrewder plan. Why drown them? That was the ultimate decree. First and foremost, we'll tell the Jewish midwives to simply abort the child before it's born. And he instructed the Jewish midwives to undertake this goal. So the Ramban asked a simple question. Why can't the Mitzrayim simply kill all the male children? Ultimately, that's what they did by drowning them. Why go to the process of having to convince the midwives of the Jewish people to simply commit an abortion, a murder, as the Jewish women were giving birth, the Jewish mothers were about to give birth. So the midwives were instructed to strangle the children. Says the Ramban, because of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is based on one principle, that the Jewish people are subhuman. We say in Eicha that they have made the Jewish people, the enemies of the Jewish people, have made them scum, dirt, subhuman. And the proof that they are subhuman is that even midwives that are supposed to be sympathetic and caring for little babies, they will be the ones that will commit murder. So now all the Ummah Yisraelim will simply say, they're taka subhuman, and they deserve the affliction and the sorrow and the travail. This was the diabolical plan of Paro. He will be the refined person, and he's doing a favor, as it were, by simply afflicting and murdering children. Of course, that was not the real reason. The real reason was fear, terror, that maybe the Jewish people will have a Redeemer that will be born soon, and he will undertake a miraculous undertaking to redeem millions and millions of Jewish people, and no question about it, the Egyptians will suffer. So this was in order to avoid this very terrible scenario from the point of view of Paro. It's all lies. No truth whatsoever about it. And that's the sort of anti-Semitism. The big lie, like Himmler tried to convince, that the Jew is worthless, subhuman. And that's how the enemies of the Jewish people operate. And of course, the Ivriyos refused. And we all know that Hitler, Yamach Shemot, in the course of World War II, forced Jewish men and women to come to a hotel in Warsaw, and they had a dinner, a feast of all the best food possible. An orchestra, he forced them to dance, and the caption was, do you see who these Jewish people are? They're celebrating while their brethren, their brothers and sisters, are in concentration camps. Totally indifferent. This is propaganda. This is the big lie of Himmler. You say it over enough times so you might convince the unconvinced. Of the worthlessness of the Jew. Of course, this was all manufactured because the Jewish people were a scapegoat. Inflation was out of control in Germany at the time, just like inflation is out of control in Iran. And to avert what's happening today in Iran, which is, of course, a revolution against the Islamic Republic. So Hitler decided to blame the Jewish people, and if we exterminate the Jewish people, that will solve the economic problem of inflation. Of course, it's pure lies, unadulterated lies, but this is how anti-Semitism operates. It's based on distortions. It's based on lying, as if to make the Jewish people deserve the absolute worst, and we have it today as well. And in this terrible situation, we see something really remarkable. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, of blessed memory, Moran Rosh HaYeshiva Zeichat Tzaddik V'Kadosh Livracha, had an original pshat when Yosef in Parashas Vayigash reveals his true identity to the brothers, and he says, Ani Yosef, Ha'or Avichai. So the Chazal said when he revealed himself, and he says, I am Yosef, my father's still alive, so this was a rebuke addressed to the brothers, to the point that they were so alarmed that they actually fell backwards. And everybody should take a lesson from the reaction and the response of the brothers that were simply alarmed that this is Yosef, to the point that they almost collapsed. And yet Chazal tell us that this was a musar and a teichacha. It was a rebuke. A rebuke against what? So there's many answers. We spoke about it in the past. The Beis Halevi. However, Reb Chaim Shmulevitz said a very novel answer, and it's a very true answer. Ani Yosef. Do you realize that? You must be shocked. Yosef told his brothers that I am Yosef because you tried everything possible to make sure that the dreams that I mentioned to you, that one day you will bow down to me because I will become a king and I have kingship. Every single endeavor possible to make sure that that will never take place, you have undertaken. First, you wanted to kill me. Number two, you sold me into slavery, and you were not sure that I would ever live again. A Jewish young boy in the slave market that comes to Mitzrayim, who knows what will happen? So you also thought that that will 100%, 120% for sure, negate, nullify the dreams. They'll never come true. You were confident that right now, due to your actions of selling me, that this would remove all possibilities of the dream materializing and becoming realized through you bowing down to me. So Ani Yosef, this was the greatest rebuke possible, because this explained to the brothers that you should never rely on your own ishtadlus, on your own koiches, on your own power to bring about a result. And not only did you think that through your own powers that were under your control, you would negate the dreams of Yosef. On the contrary, you brought him about. That's a rebuke. Many times we undertake a ishtadlus, thinking that with our ishtadlus, with our endeavor, our arduous labor, that we will accomplish a certain goal. And if min hashamayim was decreed that the opposite should be true, the opposite should take place, So our ishtadlus not only will not achieve the goal, it'll be a boomerang. It'll bring about the exact opposite, because that is the decree that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has decreed, and we can do nothing to in any way change that decree. This was a tremendous lesson, that ishtadlus is no more than a means to an end, right? We can only do ufsaton, said Rabbi Israel Salanter. That's what Kadosh Baruch Hu, he will achieve, if he wants to, the goal that we have in mind. But we should never think that our actions, our activity can bring about that goal. And if we do think so, many times there'll be a boomerang and the opposite will take place. So here we have a luminary that's born, a great luminary, that's Moshe Rabbeinu. And the entire story of Moshe Rabbeinu from the beginning to the end is also a lesson that many times his shtadlus will backfire and have the opposite effect. There's no question about it that had Moshe been born in Midian, had Moshe been raised in Midian, he would be the same great Moshe, the greatest person of all time. No question about it. So why was it necessary for Moshe to be born in Mitzrayim? Why was it necessary for Moshe to be discarded by his parents because of a fear that they can't hide him anymore? And soon, Gestapo, the Egyptian army personnel, will come, take him, also his mother, and drown him in front of the mother, to add insult to injury, cruelty to brutality. And he was miraculously saved. The Hashgacha Elyoina made sure that he was saved. By who? By the daughter of Paroi. And the daughter of Paroi saw that he was a Jewish child, had Rachmanis on him, was compassionate, and she brought him into the palace of Paroi. Paroi educated him, gave him a feeling of royalty, of fearlessness. He was a royal personage. And at the end, that was necessary because he was able to confront Paroi fearlessly, because he was also an individual that felt that he had the dignity of Malchus, of kingship and kingdom, because he was raised to be a king in the home of Paroi. Why was this necessary? Because Paroi did everything possible to make sure that the Redeemer of the Jewish people will never be born. And not only was he unsuccessful, he was a failure insofar as preventing the Goel of Yisrael from being born. On the contrary, it's the greatest boomerang of all time. He was the one that raised him. He was the one that educated him. He was the one that instilled in Moshe, says the Ibn Ezra, to be a royal individual, somebody who was qualified to be a leader. Unbelievable boomerang. So we see over here in the dark, grisly night, when Klal Yisrael was suffering such travail, avodas haperach. Nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to show, even in the greatest darkness, there's a light, and this light will ultimately be a luminary that will light up for Klal Yisrael, to the extent not only they will be redeemed, but they will be the Amanifra, they will be the chosen people. Of course, they will have to endure sorrows and miseries, but nevertheless, there will be a redemption, and the Redeemer, ironically, was saved by the daughter of Paroi, who she rebelled against the wishes of her father, and Paroi himself raised the Redeemer. One of the greatest ironies of all time, and perhaps the greatest irony of all time. So this was a great luminary. How did this luminary come into the world? Because there was even a greater luminary which simply defies the imagination. And she was the one that brought the luminary of Moshe into the world. It's interesting, very fascinating, that the Jewish history and the very fundamental yesod of Klal Yisrael was established in the bris bein absarim. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu made with Avram Avinu, Ki gel yezaracho, b'yeretz lo lohem, v'avodum v'inu oisam alba meyoy shono. The selection of Am Yisrael as the chosen people will only be realized, as we mentioned a moment ago, through travail, through suffering and affliction in the course of 400 years. And after enduring such sorrows and miseries, Kadosh Baruch Hu said, your children will be redeemed. No question about it. And yet we know that in Hashamayim, the Pasuk tells us in Shir Hashirim, Hail doidi zebo medalig Elohim, mekabetz ala gvoyes. That was in Yitzias Mitzrayim, because the Gula was bedilug ubikfitzo. There was a type of dilug, skipping, and a type of jumping from 400 to 210 years. And of course, the question is, for sure it said 400 years. How did it become 210 years? So the Chazal and the Ravid say, because of Koshi HaShibud. And the Ravid, the great Rishonim in Hilchos Tshuva Perek Vav Halacha Hey, states as follows: Ki haboiche yomar va'avodnu b'inu esam d'alem meyoy shana. They'll be afflicted, but they afflicted him even more. Ve'hem ovdu b'hem b'porach, avodas bar, back-breaking affliction, and also they committed murder. That was not the intent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the subhuman cruelty that the Miriam subjected the Bnei Yisrael, that was the reason that 400 years was diminished to 210 years, because qualitatively, those 210 years equaled 400 years. So the Gezeru was 400 years, and it came to its completion through 210 years. It was accelerated because of the Koshi HaShibud. Now we have something very fascinating. We see that the Ravid tells us that this was not intended in the bris bein absarim, murder of Jewish children. So the Gemara tells us something very fascinating, and this is a great luminary, one of the greatest of all time, and indeed, she was the savior of the Jewish people. Without her, there would be no Jewish people whatsoever. There would be no Redeemer. And without a Redeemer, there will not be a redemption from Mitzrayim. And the Jewish people would have assimilated Mitzrayim and disappeared from the face of the earth as a unique people, the descendants of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. At that time, the Gadol Hador was the father of Moshe. Amram, and the Gemara reports to us a fascinating story. Moving. Omar Rabbi Simoi. Rabbi Simoi states emphatically that after the Gezerah was being implemented by the army and by the police, they went around searching. Like Rashi says, Rashi tells us clear as the day, The Gezerah was a real Gezerah. Army personnel came around, searched the house. If there was a boy, they took the child and drowned him mercilessly in the Nile River. Amram, who was the leader of the Jewish people, said, Lashov onu amelim, all of our efforts are in vain. Omad divorced his wife. He was the Gadol Hador. He was a great influencer. So everybody else among the Jewish population imitated him. And Chazal tell us, Amdu Kulam v'Gilshu es L'Sheiseyem, because of this decree of every Zohar, the oil, right? Kol ben Yiloid, Leiga Tashlifu, brought total despair and hopelessness to Amram, that he divorced his wife and there will not be any child that will be begotten. All the male children will be killed, so it's not worthwhile having children. His daughter was 3 years old, and she said, Abba, Kasha Gezerascha Yisamisha Para, your decree is worse than Para's decree. In other words, she told her father, who was the Gadol Hador, you're worse than Stalin. Because Paro Legazar El Al Zacharim, only on the males he made a decree, and your Gezer, you also decreed on the Nekevas, the female children should not come into the world. And then she said something powerful. Paro Legazar El Ba'olam Hazeh, Ve'ata Gazarta Al Zacharim, Gam Ba'olam Hazeh, Ve'gam Ba'olam Haba. Gazar, on not only on the Schar, but on the Nekevas as well. There will be no children that will be born. Klal Yisrael will obviously disappear, but that was not her point. The fact that you will prevent Jewish children from being born, so you are preventing them from achieving the supreme blessing of reaching Olam Haba. So we shall read Rashi, with your permission. The Chazon Ish said this is one of the biggest Yesodis that we have in Yiddishkeit. So Rashi says the following: Shenoilodim v'mesim, the children that will be born, Miriam said, they'll die, no question about it. The male children will die. It might take a month, might take 2 months, might take a day, but they will surely die. But so what? But they will merit and they'll be restored to the true life, the eternal life in Olam Haba, the world to come. Ata Gazarta Olam Haba. Why? Since they're not born and they will not come to Olam Haba. In other words, the Olam HaNeshamas. There's a separate entity, there's a world of Neshamas. For the Neshamas, for the souls of the Jewish people to come to Olam Haba, which is a different world, it's the ultimate bliss, the greatest blessing of all. Rashi tells us they have to come through this world. They have to pass by Olam Haba. You cannot get to Olam Haba if you don't go through the vehicle of coming into this world. So Ato Gazarta, you made a Gezerah to prevent and deprive all those Neshamis and the Olam HaNeshamis that will come into this world through a natural birth of a father and a mother from entering Olam Haba. Amram agreed. He remarried, and everybody else remarried. And from Machzeh Grushasai, from remarrying his divorcee, who came into the world? Moshe Rabbeinu. Without Miriam's explaining the true hashkafas and the Chazon Ish of Judaism, Moshe would not have been born. And she was responsible for Moshe. And she looked after Moshe, and she made sure that Moshe ultimately would have some sort of safe passage. She brought Yocheved, the mother of Moshe. She convinced Basya, right, to take her and raise her in the house of Parai. She took care of the baby Yocheved, unbelievable, and everything. Basya, the daughter of Parai, agreed, and she's from the 9 people that went up to heaven without having to die. A heroic individual that was granted something which just about no one was ever granted. So this was Miriam. Interestingly, we see that the first avodah that Klal Yisrael undertook in such bitter conditions and under such bitter decrees was, as the Gemara states unequivocally, that they brought children into the world. Why? Because Miriam at 3 years old became the new leader of Klal Yisrael. Amram was rejected. What was his hashkafa? What was his worldview? He said it openly. La shavanu amelim. We are working in vain. What's the purpose? What's the use of bringing children to the world? If there'll be a male, it will be destroyed in front of the mother. We have so many sorrows we have to endure, such suffering and pain. Do the parents have to have an additional, overpowering, overwhelming trauma of bringing a child into the world and having the military of Mitzrayim drown him many times in front of the mother? Of course not. What did Miriam accomplish? One of the greatest accomplishments of all time. A 3-year-old girl, like the Chazon Ish said, expressed the aleph beis, the basics of Judaism. And what was that? On the contrary, L'tachlis anu amelim. And in this crucible of pain, the greatest nation of all time reached the highest level possible. Like the Zohar said, the Zohar states it emphatically. The pasuk says, "Vayehi sham legoy gadol otzavarov." The Jewish people in Mitzrayim became a great, outstanding, unique nation. Pasuk is in Shir HaShirim. Kishayshana bein achechem, kein doidi bein abonos. Where does the rose grow the best? Among thorns. Where did the Jewish people grow to their highest level possible? Or perhaps in all the ages of humanity, they reached the highest level was Dafke in Mitzrayim. Melamed shayu mitzuyanim sham. This pasuk teaches us they reached excellence, perfection. On the contrary, said the Chazon Ish, we have to bring babies into the world. Immediately, the babies will be cast into the sea and drowned, many times in front of the parents. So Amram said it's not worth it. And therefore, the entire conception of the child is in vain. We labor in vain. Miriam said we labor for a higher purpose. The Jewish people discounted their personal sorrows, their personal distress, and they brought children into the world because by doing so, they're boino elamos. They create worlds, elamos elyonim, and they're doing something so purposeful that they're bringing children into this world, out from the Olam HaNeshamis, and they need to pass through this world. And if they just pass through this world 1 second, the accomplishment defies the imagination. It's amazing that these children will come Leilam Haba. And like the Panovich Rav said, B'Shem Ishver, Reb Vilka Miriam, what is the true nachas that parents have? What should be the true nachas that parents have? That the children were righteous children, that the children ultimately went to Olam Haba. That's the true nachas, not the great success that they had in this world, not the great station that they realized, not the great parnasa, not even the great family, but that they were able, the parents were able to make sure that their children went b'derech HaTorah, they went to the proper way, and they reached Olam Haba. That's the true nachas. When you're Bayna Olamos and you bring a soul into Olam Haba. And over here, these children were innocent children, died al Kiddush Hashem because they were Jewish, murdered mercilessly, anti-Semitically. They, of course, merit Olam Haba. Nobody merits more than that. So this really defies the imagination that the people under such circumstances, in other words, despite the fact that Bnei Yisrael were in a bleak, grisly, dark, shiftless existence, that God forbid, Miriam said, despite everything, totally illogical, totally. But God forbid we should stop bringing children into the world, because this is a real purposeful activity that we can do in times of slavery and affliction. And if we do this, it's not totally lost. And this deep insight reveals to us how the Jewish people were able to suffer and tolerate Shibud Mitzrayim by doing purposeful activities, despite the fact that it hurt them, despite the fact that it was traumatic. Somehow or other, don't know how, they were able to overcome all of their natural feelings and were able to sublimate them to do something so purposeful for somebody else. It was a purposefulness exists. There was meaning. It was unique. It was a unique awareness. And like the Chazon Ish states that these drowned babies will live again, and they'll live in the world of bliss, in the world thereafter. Unborn babies that are neshamis, from the neshamis, are denied that supreme bliss. And this was the first avodah that the Jewish people undertook. L'tachlis onu amelim. And this is how they survived the worst subhuman conditions. They were placed in, they were the opposite, angelic personalities, not subhuman. The Mitzri were subhuman, but in subhuman conditions, they rose. Like the beautiful roses rise among thorns. And this for us is one of the greatest limudim possible, that we started Shovavim, 6 weeks, where we have a chance to improve ourselves, to grow spiritually, intellectually, and we should derive a lesson from Am Yisrael and from Miriam, who had a deep insight. And somehow or other, we have to get out of our routine and focus exclusively on purposeful undertakings. This is the great luminary Miriam. And that is why Miriam, after the Jewish people were redeemed, so the Torah went out of its way to state, Vatan lohem Miriam, Shirul Hashem ki go. Miriam is singled out. Moshe is also singled out. He said Shira Sayam. But Moshe is singled out together with the Jewish people. Oz Yoshir Moshe of Bnei Yisrael. So Rashi says, because Moshe is on a scale, a weight scale equals 600,000 Jews. That's why he was singled out. But nevertheless, he's together with Am Yisrael, with Bnei Yisrael. Oz Yoshir Moshe, like Kriyas Yamsuf, when the Egyptians drowned, he's mentioned together with Klal Yisrael. Not so by Miriam. Miriam is mentioned by herself. Because all of the Shiras Hayam that the Jewish people were able to sing praises to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Moshe, there was only one person that was responsible for that. The great luminary Miriam. So the Torah says, Vatan lohem Miriam, Shirul Hashem ki go. Miriam herself. She was the first of the great luminaries. Without her, there would be no other luminaries, including Moshe Rabbeinu. She's the most remarkable person, perhaps, of all time. A 3-year-old girl came up with such a deep insight. And because of her, she was a real influencer, a real motivator. Klal Yisrael reached its greatest level of all time.